The plane's cabin buzzed with the usual hum of people, settling in, some adjusting their seats, others pulling down the overhead bins, and a few glancing nervously at the window. As the stewardesses moved up and down the aisle, Maria could hear the faint sounds of people chatting and the rustling of newspapers and magazines, but she was focused on her task, making sure everyone had what they needed. She had been working as a flight attendant for a few years now, and the routine was familiar to her. She knew how to handle the occasional demanding passenger, the frequent flyer who thought they owned the air, and the nervous traveller who gripped the armrest too tightly. But this time there was something different, something about the elderly man who had just boarded the plane. He seemed out of place, not in a way that made him stand out too obviously, but just enough that she couldn't help but notice him. His movements were slow, calculated, almost like he was taking extra care with each step. The cane he leaned on was polished, the wood gleamed in the overhead light, though it was clear he wasn't using it out of necessity, but more out of habit, or perhaps pride. His clothes were simple, nothing flashy, yet his suit fit him perfectly, as if it had been tailored years ago, and still held its shape. He had a certain dignity about him that Maria couldn't quite place. His age was evident. His hair was white and thin, but his eyes were sharp, piercing, like he could see right through her, even from across the aisle. Maria didn't have time to dwell on it, though she had other passengers to attend to, and the elderly man was seated in the front row, away from the hustle and bustle of the others. She moved quickly from one seat to another, checking for seat belts and asking if anyone needed extra assistance. It wasn't until she passed him again that she saw him watching her. His eyes were fixed on her now, and she felt a slight chill run down her spine. It wasn't anything threatening, just an awareness, a subtle sense that she was being observed too closely. She gave him a polite smile as she passed, but he didn't return it. Instead, he simply nodded slowly, as if he knew something she didn't. Maria felt the slightest discomfort and shook it off, thinking he was just another quiet traveller. She continued her duties, but with a little less confidence than before. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Maria helped with the final checks for takeoff and gave her safety spiel with practiced ease, while the elderly man remained seated in the same position, his cane resting across his lap, and his gaze now wandering out the window. Maria didn't think much of it at the time. She was busy adjusting the cabin lights and making sure the food cart was prepped for later. But when the plane finally reached cruising altitude and the fasten seatbelt sign clicked off, Maria could hear the man's voice calling her name. She turned to find him watching her intently. His tone was calm, almost too calm, considering the turbulence they had just passed through. He looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold a quiet expectation. "Excuse me, miss," he said softly. "Could I trouble you for a glass of water?" Maria didn't think much of it, and without missing a beat she nodded. "Of course," she said, turning to get the drink from the cart. She didn't think there was anything unusual about the request, but something about the way he asked made her feel as though this wasn't just a simple request. It was almost like he was testing her, seeing how she would respond. Maria quickly handed him the water and returned to her duties, but even after she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye. His calm demeanor, his composed nature, seemed so different from the usual passengers she dealt with. There was something in the air, something unspoken, but Maria didn't have time to dwell on it just yet. The rest of the flight awaited, and there were plenty of other things to focus on. As the flight continued, Maria moved through the aisles doing her usual checks, adjusting the overhead bins, handing out snacks, and keeping the passengers comfortable. But her mind kept drifting back to the elderly man who had asked for water. There was something about him that unsettled her, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. His presence felt almost too deliberate, like he wasn't just a random traveller, but someone who had a story to tell, a story she hadn't yet discovered. It wasn't the first time she'd dealt with older passengers, but this man felt different. He didn't fit the mold of the typical retiree looking for a quiet trip. He wasn't a wanderer lost in his thoughts, or a chatty senior eager to recount tales of his past. He was composed almost to a fault, and his eyes kept following her as she moved through the cabin. It wasn't overt, but it was noticeable every time she glanced his way. He was watching her just enough to make her feel as though he knew something she didn't, something she should know, but didn't. The strange feeling lingered. As the hours passed, Maria tried to shake it off, but it was hard. The rest of the flight seemed to blur in a haze of routine, the same old tasks, the same old passengers. But this man kept popping into her thoughts. His quiet nature contrasted sharply with the bustle of the plane, and his stillness had an unsettling quality to it. She had seen many passengers on her flights, but none like him, none who made her feel this strange mix of curiosity and unease every now and then. She would look over at him again. His gaze would still be fixed on her, and she would quickly look away, pretending she didn't notice. It felt silly, but she couldn't help it. His presence in the cabin seemed almost like an enigma to her. Just when she thought she had it figured out, just when she assumed he was harmless, he did something unexpected. As the flight reached its halfway point, Maria began preparing for the drink cart again. As she passed by his seat, she heard him call her name once more. She turned to him with her usual smile. "Yes, sir," she said. "Can I get you anything else?" This time the man's voice held a slightly different tone. There was no casual warmth in his words. Instead, there was a quiet authority, a kind of underlying strength that made Maria pause for a moment. His eyes locked onto hers, and she felt herself stop in place for a second. It was like his gaze was holding her there, making her wait in the silence. Between them, he seemed to consider her for a moment before speaking again. His words were deliberate, slow, as though carefully choosing each one. "You must have seen a lot of things during your time in the air," he said, his voice steady and calm. "What's it like seeing so many people come and go, always the same faces, but never really knowing who they are?" Maria's smile faltered for a brief moment. It was an odd question, nothing like the usual small talk she had with passengers. She'd heard it all before, the typical chatter about where people were going or how long they had been flying. But this felt different. She wasn't sure how to respond at first. She glanced at him, unsure whether he was just making conversation or if there was something more to his question. But she quickly recovered and laughed lightly, trying to brush off the oddness. "Well, I guess it's a bit of both," she said. "We meet so many people, and you get to know them in little ways. But you're right, we never really get to know who they are, what their story is." She smiled again, but this time it didn't feel as natural. As before, the conversation seemed to hang in the air, between them an invisible thread, pulling her in just enough to make her uncomfortable. She could feel his eyes still on her, even as she moved away. The rest of the flight passed by, but Maria couldn't shake the feeling that the man's words were still echoing in her mind. What did he mean by that? What was he trying to get at? And why did she feel like he wasn't just talking about the usual flight attendant small talk? Maybe she was just overthinking it, but there was something off about him. And the more she tried to push it away, the stronger the feeling grew. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours as Maria went about her tasks. Her hands moved mechanically, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about the elderly man and his cryptic words, the way he had asked that strange question about people coming and going on flights. It didn't sit right with her. He wasn't just making small talk. He was probing, as if he knew something that she didn't. But how could he? He was just a man on a plane. She had met countless passengers like him. And yet something about him felt off. Maria tried to push the thoughts aside. She had a job to do after all, and there were plenty of other passengers to check on. But as she moved down the aisle, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she was being watched. It wasn't just a passing glance this time, it was more intense. And she couldn't help but glance over at him again. She found his eyes waiting for hers, his gaze unwavering, like he was silently calling her to him. Her heart skipped a beat for a moment. She almost forgot to breathe. She quickly looked away, feeling a flush of embarrassment for letting her guard down. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered like a shadow, just at the edge of her awareness. Every time she passed by his seat, she felt his eyes on her, and every time it made her feel more uneasy. It was as if he was silently watching her every move, waiting for something. But what was he waiting for? What was he expecting from her? Maria's thoughts raced. But before she could dwell on them too long, the announcement came that the plane was about to start its descent into their destination. Maria moved into autopilot mode once again. She finished her tasks, preparing the cabin for landing, checking seat belts, and putting away the drink cart. But her mind was still preoccupied with the elderly man. As the plane began to lower itself into the clouds, she found herself glancing back at him, his hands now resting on the cane in front of him, his eyes still locked onto hers. She didn't know what it was about him that unnerved her, but the closer they got to landing, the more she felt the pressure building in her chest. It was like she was waiting for something she couldn't put her finger on, but knew was coming. She moved quickly down the aisle again, this time focusing on her job as best as she could. But she couldn't stop the anxiety from creeping in. There was just something about him that didn't add up. As the final approach began, the plane shook slightly and passengers braced themselves for landing. Maria noticed that the elderly man had shifted in his seat. His posture was straighter, now his eyes even sharper. He was watching her, as if waiting for the exact moment when she would finally approach him. She felt her palms begin to sweat, her stomach turned with an unsettling mix of curiosity and dread. The plane rumbled as it began its descent, and for the briefest moment Maria thought she saw a faint smile tug at the man's lips. But it wasn't the kind of smile you would expect from someone his age. It was subtle, almost like he knew something she didn't, and it sent a chill down her spine. She couldn't look away from him, even though everything inside her told her to do so. She had to get away from this feeling. She had to get away from him. But somehow she couldn't help herself. The man hadn't said anything else since their earlier conversation, and yet she felt as though the silence between them was growing heavier with each passing second. And then, as the plane began to level out and the landing gear touched down, the elderly man's voice broke through the tension. "I know what you're thinking," he said, his tone as calm and steady as it had been before. "You've been wondering who I really am, haven't you?" Maria froze. Her heart skipped another beat, and she turned slowly to face him, her breath catching in her throat. She had to fight to keep her composure. She didn't know how to respond. She wasn't sure if she wanted to know what he was about to say, but she had no choice now. She had to hear it. Maria stood there, frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't expected him to speak again, let alone say something so direct. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine. His words hung in the air between them as the plane's wheels touched the runway, the hum of the engines fading into the background. She tried to swallow, but her throat was dry. She wasn't sure what to say or how to respond. All she could do was stare at him. The elderly man's eyes never left hers. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze that made her feel both small and important at the same time. It was as though he was looking right through her, into some hidden part of her that she hadn't even known existed. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't explain why, but something inside her told her not to say anything just yet, not to rush it. She took a small step back and gave him a tight smile, trying to keep her composure. But the unease in her chest only grew stronger with every passing second. He continued to watch her, his hands resting on the cane, as though he were waiting for her to answer. But she didn't know how to answer him. What was there to say? What did he mean by that statement? Had he been watching her the whole flight? Had he known all along that she was curious about him, that she felt something was off? Maria's mind was spinning, but she couldn't bring herself to look away from him. Something kept her tethered to the moment, as though there was more to his words than a simple observation. She felt the pressure building in her chest. As the last few minutes of the flight ticked away, she glanced quickly at the other passengers, but they were all preoccupied with their own things. No one else seemed to notice the exchange between her and the elderly man, but she couldn't ignore it. She couldn't let go of the feeling that there was something she needed to understand, something that had been there all along, but she had missed it every time Maria finally found her voice, though it came out softer than she intended. "What do you mean?" She asked her words, almost a whisper. She wasn't sure why she'd spoken. But she couldn't help herself. The man's smile was faint, but it was there again. It wasn't the kind of smile one would expect from a tired traveler. It wasn't kind or warm. It was knowing. It was as though he were the keeper of some secret that only he could share with her at that moment. "I know exactly what you're thinking," he said, his voice even quieter now. "You're wondering how a man like me could be traveling alone. You're wondering why I don't fit the usual pattern of the people you encounter on this flight, aren't you?" His words were so calm, so matter-of-fact, that Maria couldn't help but feel a rising sense of dread. They were too precise, too exact, like he had read her mind and known every question that had been bubbling up inside her the entire flight. How could he possibly know what she was thinking? How could he understand her unease so thoroughly? Her mouth went dry again, and she tried to steady herself. She forced herself to take a breath before speaking, though she was barely able to control the trembling in her hands. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said, the words barely audible over the quiet hum of the engines as the plane started to slow its descent. "You seem like someone who has seen much of the world," he said, still watching her, his voice low but firm. "And yet you find yourself unsure about me. You're thinking about who I am, why I'm here, and whether I'm telling the truth about my past. But I assure you I am not the man you think I am." The way he said it made her feel like she was the one who was being judged, the one under scrutiny, as if he were testing her patience or her ability to understand something larger than the small world of the airplane. Maria could feel the beads of sweat forming on her forehead. She had to fight to keep calm, to keep her voice steady. But she couldn't stop the words that tumbled out of her mouth without thinking. "Who are you then?" she asked before she could stop herself. It was a question that had been burning in her for hours, a question she couldn't ignore anymore. He leaned forward slightly, his smile still in place, but his eyes deepened with something she couldn't quite place. "I'm someone who has been watching the world change for decades," he said, his tone almost a whisper now. "And I've seen enough to know that not everything is as it seems. You might not understand now, but soon you will." The plane had come to a full stop, and the seatbelt sign flickered off. But Maria didn't move. She couldn't take her eyes off him as the other passengers started to gather their belongings. It was as if time had slowed down, and the world outside the plane didn't exist anymore. All she could hear was the quiet ticking of her own heartbeat, and his words echoing in her mind. "Soon you will." What did he mean by that? Was she missing something? Was this man more than just a quiet traveler? The plane had finally come to a stop, but Maria couldn't move. Her legs felt heavy, as if they were rooted to the floor. Her mind raced. She wanted to join the others, to hurry and get through the final steps of landing, but something about the elderly man kept her from leaving his presence. She could feel his gaze on her, like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. Every other sound in the cabin seemed to fade away. All she could hear was his voice still echoing in her mind. "Soon you will." What did that mean? Why had he said that as she stood frozen in place? The man didn't seem to hurry. Either he didn't reach for his things or move to stand. He remained in his seat, watching her, the same calm gaze, now tinged with something she couldn't place. It wasn't arrogance or malice, but something more unsettling, something that felt like he knew more than he was letting on. The other passengers around her began to gather their things and chat quietly as they prepared to exit the plane, but Maria stayed still. She could feel the buzz of conversation around her, but it was as if they were in another world, a world that didn't matter right now. Everything felt distant and muted. Her eyes kept flicking back to the man. His presence became impossible to ignore, as though it were drawing her in. The longer she stared at him, the more she felt like there was a storm gathering just beneath the surface, and she was waiting for it to break. He watched her silently, his hands still resting on his cane, his expression unreadable. But there was something about the stillness that made her feel as if he were studying her carefully. She felt exposed, like he could see straight through her, as if she were an open book for him to read. Maria took a step forward, but her body was reluctant. Her mind was screaming to just walk away to finish her work. But something stopped her. She glanced over at the other passengers and saw that most were already standing and stretching, but none of them seemed to notice the strange atmosphere between her and the elderly man. As if nothing was out of the ordinary, they were all busy with their own thoughts. Unaware of the tension that had built in the cabin, Maria turned back to face him, and for a moment she felt the urge to ask him more questions. But the words caught in her throat. What would she say? Where would she even start? The man seemed to read her hesitation, and then he spoke again, his voice low but clear. "You're wondering why I'm here, aren't you?" He said, his tone almost like a quiet revelation, as though he had the answer to a question that had been gnawing at her all along. "You're wondering what brought me onto this flight, why a man like me would choose this moment to cross paths with someone like you." Maria's breath caught in her throat. His words hit too close to something deep within her, something she hadn't even fully understood yet. She forced herself to breathe slowly. She was tired of being the passive one, tired of feeling like he was controlling the conversation. "Yes," she said, her voice a little shaky but determined. "I'm wondering that." The elderly man leaned back in his seat slightly, as though he were preparing to tell a story that had been waiting to be heard for years. His eyes twinkled in the dim light of the cabin. But there was something more to the glint than just age or wisdom. It was something darker, something that suggested he wasn't just a retired lawyer traveling to visit family. He was someone with a purpose, someone who had been around long enough to know things that others didn't. "You see," he began, his voice softer now, "I've been watching people like you for a long time." Maria felt her stomach tighten, but she didn't look away. She had to know where this was going. "I've seen the way the world changes, how people move through life thinking they have control. But in reality, everything is far more unpredictable than we think." He paused, and for a moment Maria thought he was finished. But then he added quietly, "You think you're in control of your world, but the truth is everything is already set in motion, and you're just a small part of a much bigger picture." Maria's heart raced. His words seemed to echo through the cabin, louder than anything else. They didn't make sense, but at the same time they made too much sense. She had heard similar things before in the abstract from philosophers or in passing conversations, but hearing it from him, from this quiet elderly man sitting in front of her, made it feel so real, so immediate. The way he said it felt personal. It felt like he was talking about her directly. Maria opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak he cut her off. "You'll understand soon enough," he said, his smile thin but certain. "Just give it time." With that he shifted in his seat, reached for his bag, and began to gather his things, as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just had an exchange that would change everything. Maria stood there, still processing his words. The other passengers were already beginning to move toward the exit, but Maria couldn't make herself leave. She watched the man as he slowly made his way down the aisle and out of the plane, his figure disappearing into the crowd outside as the plane doors opened, and the cabin began to empty. Maria was left standing alone for a moment longer, her mind racing with questions. She didn't have answers to who was he really, why had he said what he said, and what did he mean by "soon you will." Maria stood frozen as the last of the passengers filed past her, heading toward the exit. The sounds of footsteps and murmurs faded into the background as she stood there in a daze. The elderly man's words still rang in her ears. Everything about that exchange felt wrong, but at the same time it felt like something she couldn't ignore. She had tried to shake it off, tried to push it out of her mind, but the more she thought about it, the more the words lingered. "Soon you will." What did he mean by that? Was he speaking in riddles? Or was he giving her warning? Her hands shook slightly as she finally snapped back to reality. The aisle was almost empty now, except for the lingering sense of unease that seemed to fill the space around her. she forced herself to move to the front of the plane and began the final checks for deplaning. As her feet moved mechanically through the cabin, her mind wandered back to the man. What did he know about her? Was he just another eccentric passenger who had nothing better to do than spout cryptic nonsense? Or was there something more? She glanced over at the door where he had exited, but there was no sign of him anymore. He had simply disappeared into the crowd outside, and it felt like he was a ghost vanishing into thin air. She couldn't help but feel that the encounter had somehow changed everything, but changed what? Maria couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't been the one in control of that moment, that somehow he had been the one guiding the conversation, pulling her along on a path she hadn't chosen. She hurried through the rest of her duties, making sure the cabin was cleared and the lights were turned off, but her mind refused to settle. She couldn't stop replaying the conversation over and over again. What was it that he had said about being part of a bigger picture? Had it meant something? Or was it just the ramblings of an old man? She couldn't tell. But deep down she knew that the feeling in her chest wasn't going away. She needed answers. But where could she find them? There was no way she could just forget this. What if it was more than a strange interaction? What if it was a sign, something that she was supposed to understand, but couldn't yet? Maria finally made her way toward the cockpit to check in with the rest of the crew. As she passed by the galley, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the small window of the kitchenette. She looked tired, her face pale, her eyes drawn with exhaustion. But beneath it all there was something else, something new, something that hadn't been there before, a flicker of uncertainty, and something darker, something she couldn't explain. She turned away quickly, not wanting to dwell on it. But it wouldn't leave her. It was like the elderly man's words had taken root inside her, and now they were growing slowly, but surely she couldn't push them away any more. They were a part of her now, whether she liked it or not. The flight crew was already gathered by the time she entered the cockpit, but even their casual chatter didn't seem to register with her. She could hear the familiar sounds of the instruments, the hum of the plane's systems, but everything felt distant, muted, as though she were detached from the world around her. Her colleagues spoke, but their words didn't quite reach her. It was as if she were underwater, listening from a distance. She nodded absently as they discussed the details of the next flight, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't focus, not with the strange encounter still fresh in her mind. Finally, the conversation shifted to their final duties for the day, and Maria forced herself to snap out of her daze. She nodded in agreement and began to help with the wrap-up. But even as she went through the motions, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something had shifted, and she didn't know how to fix it. As the last of the passengers exited the plane and the doors were secured, Maria stood in the doorway, looking out at the tarmac. The evening sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty airfield. She stood there for a moment, longer than necessary, her mind still reeling from the conversation with the elderly man. His words seemed to follow her, like a shadow lingering just beyond her reach, as if they were a puzzle she was meant to solve, but the pieces didn't fit together. No matter how hard she tried to make them, she needed answers. But how could she get them? Was he just a strange old man, or had he known something she didn't? Did he have some sort of purpose that would reveal itself in time? Maria took a deep breath and turned back toward the terminal, the nagging feeling still clawing at her chest. But there was nothing more she could do for now. All she could do was wait and hope that someday soon she would understand what the man had meant when he said, "Soon you will." As she walked back inside the terminal, the unease didn't leave her. It was like a weight hanging over her every step. But Maria couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever had happened, it was far from over, and deep down she knew that it was only just beginning. Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It had been days since the flight, but the elderly man's words still lingered in her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his calm face, his knowing smile, his cryptic voice echoing, "Soon you will." It haunted her like a ghost she couldn't escape. She had tried to push it out of her thoughts. She had tried to focus on her work, on the daily routine. But nothing seemed to help. It was as though his presence was still with her, following her every step. She tried talking to her colleagues about it, but they all just brushed it off, saying she was overthinking it. Maybe she had too much on her plate. Maybe she needed some time off. But Maria knew better. There was something more to it, something about that encounter that didn't sit right with her. She decided to visit the airport again, to clear her head, to see if anything about the place would help her understand why she felt so unsettled. When she arrived at the terminal, the busy hum of the crowd greeted her. But today it felt different. The air was thick with tension, like something was about to happen. But she couldn't put her finger on it. She walked through the terminal, looking around at the familiar faces, the bustle of the passengers and workers moving about. But none of it seemed normal today. It all felt distant. Everything was muted. In the background, she wandered aimlessly for a while, trying to shake off the anxiety clawing at her chest. But no matter where she went, the feeling didn't go away. It seemed to follow her the entire time she passed by the gates and took a seat near one of the coffee stands, letting her mind wander back to the man. What did he want with her? What had he known that she didn't understand? Yet she had thought about it so many times since the flight, and no answers came to her. But then, as she sat there, a strange thought crossed her mind. What if he wasn't just a random passenger? What if he had been waiting for her? Was that possible? Or was it all just coincidence? She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought, but it clung to her like a shadow. No matter how much she tried to push it away, the nagging feeling only grew stronger. Maria glanced at the clock on the wall, the minutes ticking away. But it wasn't just the time passing that made her restless. It was the sense that something was about to change, something she couldn't control. She stood up abruptly and started walking toward the exit of the terminal when she spotted something out of the corner of her eye at one of the far gates. She froze. Her heart skipped a beat there. He was the elderly man standing by the gate, as if he had been waiting for her. He wasn't looking at her, but somehow she knew he was aware of her presence. He was still holding that cane, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. But there was a subtle difference, this time a slight shift in his stance that made her feel like the puzzle was about to click into place. She took a cautious step toward him, her breath shallow. She couldn't stop herself from walking closer. Every instinct told her to turn away, to walk in the opposite direction. But she couldn't. She had to know, she had to understand who this man really was, why he had been watching her, why he had said those strange words. She moved through the terminal at a quick pace, her heart racing in her chest. With every step closer, she got her mind raced with questions, but none of them made sense, not yet. But she felt like she was close, like something was finally going to be revealed. But when she was just a few steps away, the elderly man turned and began to walk away without a glance in her direction. It was as if he knew she was coming and had decided to leave before she could reach him. He moved with purpose, despite his age, his steps quick and deliberate. Maria's breath caught in her throat. She tried to call out to him, but her voice faltered before the words could even form in her mouth. He was already disappearing into the crowd. She stood there for a moment, frozen, her mind reeling. She didn't know what to do. She had been so sure that he was going to explain everything. But now he was gone again, just like that, slipping away without a trace. Maria stood still for a few more seconds, her heart still pounding in her chest. What was happening? Why was this man still in her life? Why couldn't she shake the feeling that she was a part of something much bigger than herself? Something she couldn't fully understand. She glanced around the terminal, hoping to spot him again. But he was nowhere in sight. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside her. But the unease remained. What was he trying to tell her? And why did it feel like her life had been altered in some way that she couldn't yet comprehend? Was this encounter just a coincidence? Or was there a deeper connection at play, one that she couldn't see yet, but would soon understand? She had no answers, only more questions, and she knew that the truth was far from being revealed. Maria couldn't stop herself. Her heart was pounding in her chest, as she scanned the terminal for any sign of him. But there was nothing. He was gone again, just like before. It was as though he had disappeared into thin air. She stood still for a long moment, trying to steady her breath. The words he had said, "Soon you will," echoed louder than ever in her mind. What did it mean? Why had he said that? Why couldn't she shake the feeling that she was on the edge of something monumental, something that would change everything, yet she still couldn't grasp what it was? She walked slowly through the terminal, her footsteps echoing in the quiet space. But every step felt heavier than the last, the unease growing with each passing second. She couldn't escape the feeling that she was being pulled towards something that she didn't understand, something beyond her control, something that was waiting for her just out of reach. She tried to focus on the people around her, but they all seemed so distant, as if they were part of another world. She was moving through her own reality, now one where she couldn't seem to make sense of anything. Everything felt blurred and out of focus, like a dream that was just slipping away at the edges. She couldn't ignore it anymore. There was something wrong. She had been caught in the man's web. And now there was no turning back. As she moved closer to the exit, she passed by the security desk and glanced at the monitors. On the wall, one of them flickered briefly before returning to the normal feed. But then it happened again this time. The screen froze on a single image. It was grainy, but there was no mistaking it. It was the elderly man standing in front of the gates, his face partially obscured, but unmistakably. As Maria felt her breath catch in her throat, her stomach twisted in knots. How was he on the monitor when he had just been standing right there in front of her seconds ago? Had she imagined it? Or was this part of something bigger, a part of the puzzle she hadn't figured out yet? Her hands trembled as she stepped closer to the monitor, staring at the screen. The image flickered again, and the man's face disappeared, replaced by a generic shot of the tarmac. She blinked and looked around, but there was no sign of him anywhere. The moment had passed, but the cold feeling remained lodged in her chest, like an ice-cold fist that wouldn't let go. She quickly turned away and walked out of the terminal, her steps urgent now. She had to get away. She couldn't stay there anymore, with the haunting feeling of his presence lingering in the air. But even as she stepped outside into the fresh air, it didn't feel like enough. The world around her was still off-kilter. Everything seemed too quiet, too still. She could feel her pulse in her ears, the sharp sensation of dread creeping along the edges of her thoughts. It was as though the entire universe was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, something she couldn't see, but could feel deep within her bones. She walked through the parking lot toward her car, each step feeling heavier and more deliberate. But when she reached her car and opened the door, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text message from an unknown number. Maria's stomach churned. She hadn't been expecting any messages. Not here, not now. She pulled the phone out with shaking hands and unlocked it. The message was short and to the point. "I told you that you would understand soon." The words felt like a punch to the gut, like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. She couldn't breathe. She stared at the message for a long time, her fingers frozen on the screen. How did he know? How could he know? And what did it mean? Why was he still messing with her life? Was this some kind of game? Or was it something far darker, something more dangerous? She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, even now, even though he was nowhere near her. It was as if he was still watching her. Somehow the text sent chills through her entire body, but she couldn't stop herself from replying. "What do you want from me?" Her fingers hovered over the keys, but she pressed send before she could talk herself out of it. The response came almost immediately. "I'm waiting." That was all it said. Maria's heart skipped a beat as she read the message again and again, trying to make sense of it. What did it mean? He was waiting for her, waiting for what? Waiting for her to understand the truth. But what truth? What was he waiting for her to realize? And why did it feel like the world was shifting around her, like everything was being put into place without her control? She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her mind, trying to calm the storm inside her. But she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. It was only just beginning. and she had no idea where it would lead or what she would have to face. But one thing was clear now more than ever: she was part of something much bigger than she had ever imagined. And whether she liked it or not, she was in the middle of it.